Hello, you're listening to World Update from the BBC World Service in London. This is Dan Damon. Rupert Murdoch, the most influential media proprietor in Britain for the past 40 years, will face questions from members of Parliament this afternoon, alongside his son James and the former chief executive of his UK operations, Rebecca Brooks. Members of the Culture Committee in the House of Parliament want to find out whether the Murdochs and their executives knew that there had been journalistic malpractice at the News of the World and why steps weren't taken to prevent it. Commentators are suggesting that today marks a turning point in relations between politicians and the Murdoch press, amid evidence that his newspapers illegally hacked phones, including that of a murdered teenager, and bribed police. The Labour leader, Ed Miliband, spelt out what he wants to hear from them.
What members of the public will want to know is whether Rupert and James Murdoch, and indeed Rebecca Brooks, have some remorse for what happened and are willing to apologise and say that they have let down the British people and indeed all the victims of phone hacking, and also to account for what they knew about phone hacking and when they knew it. And I'm sure they're the kind of questions that they'll be asked.
Well, Westminster is abuzz with the story. Let's go there. Naomi Grimley is there. How will the day unfold, Naomi?
Well, in about a couple of hours, we're going to hear from the senior policeman who resigned over the last couple of days. They're going to be cross-questioned by the Home Affairs Committee, and it'll be interesting to see whether, now that they've resigned, they feel a bit more liberated as to what they can say. Particularly the MPs will want to know, of course, whether there was any attempt to cover up the extent of phone hacking by the police, and also, of course, big questions about whether some more junior officers took money from the News of the World in return for information. Then in about 4 hours' time, we'll hear from James and Rupert Murdoch. They're actually only going to be in front of the committee for about an hour, so MPs will have to be quite careful when they direct their questions, that they get to the nub of the point. And then after that, we'll hear from Rebecca Brooks, who until Friday was Chief Executive of News International. That's the UK wing of News Corporation.
And how will today's events play into tomorrow's, when Parliament is to be extended for a day so that there can be a special debate on all of this?
Well, this scandal has been dubbed the scandal of the three Ps: the police, the press and the politicians. Now, on Monday, it was all about the police. Today, it's about the press because, of course, Mr. Murdoch and his son are going to be in front of the committee. Tomorrow, it switches back to the politicians because David Cameron is still beset with questions about why he decided to hire a former News of the World editor, Andy Coulson, as his director of communications. Those questions aren't going away. They've plagued him even on his tour of Africa. So he is coming back to face those questions in an extra day to Parliament's scheduled sitting.
Thanks very much indeed. That's Naomi Grimley at Westminster. There's been another dark twist to the story. Sean Hoare, a whistleblower at the heart of the scandal, a former reporter on the Sunday tabloid The News of the World, was found dead yesterday. There appeared to be no suspicious circumstances, according to police. He told the New York Times last year that Andy Coulson, the former News of the World editor, later hired as communications advisor to British Prime Minister David Cameron, was fully aware of the phone hacking. That's something Mr. Coulson has repeatedly denied. The author and broadcaster Martel Maxwell worked as an entertainment reporter at The Sun, another Murdoch paper, alongside Sean Hoare.
I knew Sean Hoare, about 2001 to 2003. I joined The Sun as its first graduate trainee in 1999 and then became a showbiz reporter a couple of years later. I had heard all these legendary stories about Sean Hoare, who'd been in the business a long time before me and was slightly intimidated. You know, Robbie Williams put him to bed. All the pop stars would be out partying with him. He was a wild man. He got great stories. I needn't have been intimidated when I met him, and Sean was the sort of Fleet Street reporter who was always first in a bar and last to leave. He was so kind. He would offer words of advice. He was a charming soul. He was very humble, from a very humble background, working class background, big Arsenal football fan, really somebody who will be missed.
In your view, was he honest?
In my experience of Sean, he was always honest. If you're referring to the hacking, then I had no experience personally of hacking. I came along many years after Sean Hoare. My experience of Sean was that he was at his best getting stories when he was out partying.
I just wonder on the question of honesty, because he is the person really who put Andy Coulson, who became the Prime Minister's communications chief, in the frame, didn't he, when he gave an interview to the New York Times and told about playing hacked messages to Andy Coulson. Would you take Sean Hoare at his word?
Well, I can't say exactly what the truth is there. What I can say is that Sean was a lovely man, and I've no reason to suspect he'd be dishonest, but that's really like me telling you what was going on in his head there. It's been proven that there was an era when things were going wrong at the News of the World, and Sean Hoare did work there at that time. So obviously it wasn't entirely his imagination. There were many things going on there at the time, but something I personally never experienced.
What was the competitive atmosphere in those tabloid newspapers?
News International, what I liked about it is that it rewards you on merit. So if you are a good story getter, you'll do well. But, you should be ambitious in any job you have or take pride in it. Of course, there was competition. I can tell you all the ways I employed, and I would do many things to get a story. They were naughty, but they were fun and they were legal. I would dress up as a waitress to go into a swanky club, or I would blag myself into an A-list party. So yes, of course there was a competitive spirit there, but it's one I really thrived on.
What about his demons, of which there were several?
He liked to drink. He was at his best when he was out drinking with contacts or celebrities. He really struggled with his demons, and you could tell that really when he was on his when he did his TV interview recently, and it's very sad. His body was giving out, but incredibly sad.
Nigel Maxwell on Sean Hoare, who had given interviews to the New York Times accusing Andy Coulson of being involved in the phone hacking, something Mr. Coulson has denied. Well, we can discuss this and what the day may tell us about the future of relations between politicians, press and police. Patrick Basham is director of the Democracy Institute, and Mary Jajewski is a columnist with the Independent newspaper in Britain. Thanks both of you for being with us on World Update. Mary, what evidence is the committee hoping to uncover?
I think that what they're trying to do is to find out, especially from Rebekah Brooks, how much, if anything, she knew about illegal practices of phone hacking when she was editor. And from James Murdoch and Rupert Murdoch, they're trying to find out whether they, as proprietor and chief executive of the newspapers in the UK, were aware and, say, turned a blind eye to, tolerated or encouraged things that were against the law.
And Patrick, how much of an impact is this having on the wider News Corporation?
It's having a considerable impact. The question is, will it continue to, and will that impact increase? I suspect that it will, because the story in recent days is starting to get a lot of play in the United States, and by that I mean not just what's happening here, but its potential impact in the US. And what we're really talking about here is the Wall Street Journal, which is the sort of personal and professional prize of Rupert Murdoch, which he's only had now for, 3-4 years. That is what his media competitors, especially the New York Times, domestically in the US, are most concerned with, if not wresting from his control, at least weakening in a business sense. So there's both a heck of a good real story here, but there's also media competition. And I think we're going to see both of those things play out in the US as they've been playing out here in the UK.
Mary, how dignified a spectacle is it for politicians who not long ago would have been glad for an invitation to meet Rupert Murdoch to be putting him in the spotlight in this way?
Well, of course, it's not particularly dignified at all, because it's less than a month that quite a lot of the MPs, I'm not sure how many of those on the actual committee that will be doing the questioning, were guests at the Rupert Murdoch summer party. Now, the interesting thing about the summer party was that some of the senior Conservatives had the good sense to stay away. So there was the embarrassing spectacle of actually more people from the opposition turning up at the summer party to court Rupert Murdoch Murdoch than there were from the government, which in a way you might see as a sort of sign of the times, that there was already a cooling of relations between government ministers and Rupert Murdoch, even before the scandal had, as it were, reached its height.
And Patrick, on the other side of the Atlantic, was a Murdoch summer party something that politicians who had influence hoped to be invited to?
Yes, well, certainly those on the right of the spectrum. So we're basically talking about Republicans. Absolutely, because Rupert Murdoch's influence in US politics, although it most recently comes from the Wall Street Journal, where it has come from for about 15 years now, and increasingly so, is Fox News, which dominates cable news in America. And it is very difficult to gain notoriety and to gain influence in conservative politics in America without having a presence on Fox News, either directly or indirectly. And so Rupert Murdoch is obviously, and Roger Ailes and his other senior employees are the conduits to that. And so Rupert Murdoch is someone that most American politicians of a conservative bent have wanted to befriend.
The Sun, it was the Sun what won it. That was one of the headlines, wasn't it, after an election which the Conservatives won, actually. So do you think that this is something that is changing now, Mary? Is this influence, which was very powerful, is that gone for good?
Well, I think that the folklore, as it were, is that it has gone for good, and this is a huge, huge change, that people think it has gone. Now, there is a totally separate question over whether that influence actually existed in the form and to the extent that a lot of MPs and politicians thought it did. So the question of whether it was the Sun what won it remains a question. We had Neil Kinnock, former leader of the Labour Party, was on the radio this morning saying that he hadn't courted Rupert Murdoch, and I think that would also have been true of Thatcher, even though she and Rupert Murdoch took similar political views. It was Tony Blair who really set the precedent for deciding that you needed Rupert Murdoch on your side. What we're seeing is the symbolic end of that. But to my mind, the end actually came sooner. It certainly was already apparent in the last election, because the Sun brought out all its forces in favour of David Cameron and the Tories. It switched sides from New Labour to the Conservatives quite early before the election, and it didn't deliver the election.
Didn't deliver a convincing majority. Well, thanks for the moment. That's Mary Dejevsky and Patrick Basham. This is World Update.